It is really an honor to be here to share this conference with you. And I just want to begin by saying I feel a bit like the worker in our Lord's parable who comes late to the work. I was raised through Catholic education or miseducation, and and only came to begin to know and to discover the fullness of the faith of the church and her liturgy and her doctrine and her lifestyle as a young adult. And interestingly, at that time, in the very beginning of that journey that God has led me on, before I saw my first traditional Mass, before I even knew the name Marcel Lefebvre, my grandmother, to whom I was very close as a child, passed away. And for a short time, I lived in her house. And during that time, some mail would still come for her. And a copy of the Fatima Crusader came, which in retrospect is quite surprising, because my grandmother, God rest her soul, of that generation embraced the new religion in many ways. But she somehow was receiving the Fatima Crusader. And I remember reading it, and it struck me. It just at the time, I thought, this is a real Catholic, not the cardboard Catholicism that I was taught in school. And again, I knew nothing about Father Gruner other than reading this Fatima Crusader. Shortly after that, I found his biography and read it, and read about his attachment to the Mass of all ages. And I think in many ways that prepared me when I found the first traditional Mass and started to learn about Archbishop Lefebvre, that experience of seeing, well, wait, this priest who was so faithful to our Blessed Mother and her son's church, and that faithfulness, I think, was the beginning of the journey which brought me, as I said, to the long years of reading and struggle to discover the truth that had been hidden from me. So in that sense, I came late. And I do want to just pause to thank Father Gruner for doing that, because I know he has worked so hard to be faithful, and it's very difficult, it must be, to spend all this time and the consecration's not happened. But I just want to let him know publicly that his faithfulness has effects which he may not even know about. And again, that little experience in my own life. But secondly, I've come late to this. I mean, you've met many years for this conference. This is the first time I'm here. And so I beg your mercy that you'll be as merciful as our Lord towards me as he is in the parable towards those who come to the work late. And so the error of Russia, the separation of church and state, the mother of God. To prevent it, and she's referring to a worse war, I will come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If they listen to my requests, Russia will convert, and there will be peace. If not, it will spread its errors throughout the world. But what are these errors of Russia? They are legion. She uses the plural. And what I'm going to say today is without prejudice to the many things which have been written and spoken about in terms of the other errors of Russia. There are many. The abandonment and loss of the true faith in favor of a diplomatic ecumenism pursued with fanaticism. But today I want to speak about a particular error, the false doctrine of the separation of church and state. And we'll examine this error from the perspective of what the church has always and everywhere taught about this relationship. So to set the tone, I want to read to you a short passage from the Russian Constitution adopted just after Our Lady spoke these words in 1918. Quote, "For the purposes of securing to the workers real freedom of conscience, the church is to be separated from the state, and the school from the church, and the right of religious and anti-religious propaganda is accorded to every citizen." Russian Constitution, the Soviet Union, 1918. The European Constitution of Human Rights, which is another interesting lesson in how this doctrine gets promoted. A constitution was proposed to the European Union, as I'm sure you know, for a vote by the people, because this is all done in the name of the people. And when the people said no, politicians said, oops, well, forget about the people, we'll just adopt it anyway through a treaty. And so here, incorporated into this treaty is the European Charter on Human Rights, which contains the following. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Article 21. The Union shall respect cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. These two, stated very differently, we'll return to see this in the end, are merely two different forms, a blatant and a soft or more covert form of this same false teaching. In the name of this religious freedom, notice how the Russian Constitution began, to secure religious freedom. Russia and Europe denied their historical and religious heritage and severed the church from civil society and its constitution. Pope Leo XIII, before Our Lady came to Fatima to warn us of the errors of Russia, saw this future in Christendom, and he penned the encyclical on the Christian constitution of states, Immortale Dei. In it, he surveyed the landscape of civil society around him, and what he saw was a society in ruins due to what he called a hackneyed approach of old. The devil, as we know, has really no new tricks. He offers the same false bargain that he did in the garden: elevate man, subordinate God. Leo XIII described this hackneyed approach of old further. Many, indeed, are those who have tried to work out a plan of civil society based on doctrines other than those approved by the Catholic Church. Nay, in these latter days, a novel conception of law has begun here and there to gain increased influence. The outcome, as it is maintained, of an age arrived at full stature and the result of progressive liberty. He went on, but that harmful and deplorable passion for innovation, which was aroused in the 16th century, threw first of all into confusion the Christian religion, and next, in natural sequence, invaded the precincts of philosophy, whence it spread among all classes of society. From this source, as from a fountainhead, burst forth all these latter tenets of unbridled license, which in the midst of the terrible upheavals of the last century were wildly conceived and boldly proclaimed as the principles and foundations of that new conception of law, which was not merely previously unknown, but was at variance on many points with not only the Christian, but even the natural law. Remember, this is before Our Lady says the errors of Russia will spread. Leo XIII saw these errors. And as Father Gruner pointed out yesterday, the errors of Russia are not necessarily the errors from Russia. They are of Russia by adoption. They begin earlier and are merely spread by Russia. These errors begin in the 16th century at the Reformation. And the error that the civil society and the state can be severed from the church. But as St. Augustine observed in his City of God, Book 19, Chapter 25, a city cannot possess even true natural virtue without the true religion. Protestantism, however, turned religion into an individual affair. Much as Chris Ferrara showed us yesterday, the attempt was made to privatize the message of Fatima. It's just for individuals. So too, the Christian teaching on the Constitution of States becomes individualized with the Protestant idea of the individual religion. The autonomous believer, according to Protestantism, has a direct individual relationship with Christ, acceptance of Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. In the ecclesiastical realm, this reduced the church to an invisible collection of all these personal churches, each with an individual and Christ. This has consequences for man as a social and political animal on the organization of society. This is the result, the separation of civil society from the public church, proclaimed by Luther, and I quote, "Assuredly a prince can be a Christian, but it is not as a Christian that he should govern. As a ruler, he is not called a Christian, but a prince. The man is Christian, but the function does not concern his religion, the privatization of religion. In my own country, our first Catholic, and I use the term loosely, President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, demonstrated before being elected that he learned his Protestant catechism well. I quote from a speech he gave in Houston in 1960. "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference. Whatever issue may come before me as president on birth control, divorce, censorship, gambling, or any other subject, I will make my decision in accordance with these views, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be the national interest, and without regard to outside religious pressure or dictates." In the very year that Our Lady asked the secret to be read, we see the error of Russia has spread across the Atlantic. So, we see the problem, at least in the beginning. Let's begin to examine this error from the traditional Catholic teaching on law, government, and civil society. To do this, we need to begin at the beginning. And every false philosophy has to create a false creation myth, a false explanation of what the world is. And so, in lieu of the constitution of the world, the eternal law, which we'll speak about in a moment, and the Garden of Eden, they, the proponents of this error, must create their own creation myth, the state of nature. Unlike the Garden of Eden, which existed and was real, they admit this thing never existed. It's a figment of their imagination. In lieu of the real eternal law, which St. Thomas tells us is a real law, they create the social contract. Now, as John mentioned, I'm a professor of law, and I teach contract law. And I'd just like to say if Mr. Rousseau or Mr. Locke or Hobbes were in my contract class, or for that matter, if any of my students wrote a contracts exam claiming that this social contract was a contract, they would fail the course. It exhibits none of the required characteristics of a contract. It has no parties that offered or accepted the bargain. We have no idea when or how it was formed. We don't even know what its contents are. All we know is that by simply breathing the air, you're bound by it. So somebody else agrees to a contract that we're all bound to, that we don't know the terms of, that the only way to amend or change is through bloody revolution. This matches no contract ever enforced by a court of law. Their whole philosophy is based on false starting points. So, let's return then to see the real starting point, the eternal law. The eternal law is nothing but, as St. Thomas tells us, the divine providence of God ordering the universe. It is a law which fixes the nature of everything God creates in the universe. And, in the course of doing so, establishes their purpose, their function, their end, as well as establishing the appropriate means for them to attain that end. And as we will develop further, what is the end of man? Well, man has two. He has a composite nature of body and soul, and so he possesses a natural end, human happiness in the temporal sphere, in its complete sense, philosophical sense of the term happiness, and a supernatural end, beatitude, knowing and loving God. And he is also fixed through the eternal law, which is a real law promulgated through the Word, the means to achieve that. And so what are the means of man to achieve the end fixed for him by the great legislator in the eternal law? That, St. Thomas tells us, is another law known as the natural law, which is nothing other than man's participation in this eternal law. All creatures are moved to their end by the means God gives them. So the beasts, the brutes, the irrational animals are moved by instinct. What makes man distinct from the animals is that he possesses a rational soul. He can know his end and freely choose it, knowingly. And so the natural law are those principles of human action which can be known by man and can be chosen by him to effect right operation or right actions. And Lucidius, in his submission to the teaching of the Second Council of Arles in 473, calls the natural law the first grace of God, per primam Dei gratiam, and affirmed, along with Romans 2:15, that the natural law is written on every human heart. God prescribed it through the eternal law, that this grace of God to man, the ability to know what is right and to choose it through right principles, is a great gift of God, this first grace, providing him the means to participate and fulfill the eternal law. So natural law makes knowable by man the goods which comprise his end. In summary, the preservation of life, the procreation and education of children, peaceful and just life in society, and knowledge of the truth and of God. The natural law provides the content, the definition for that which man needs to live. What is marriage? What is justice? Liberty? The natural law, in all of its traditional iterations through the Catholic intellectual tradition, contains the principle of the liberty of all men, the common ownership of property. But what do these terms mean? We need to access the natural law to give them meaning. If we don't, they're devoid of meaning, these terms. And we saw in the Soviet Union what, for example, the common ownership of property can mean when you remove the true meaning and substitute a man-made one. It's called communism. And so the natural law fixes for man, through his rational understanding, the meaning of these most important terms that relate to his natural and supernatural end. And so we know that these are accessible to man because he has the great gift of reason. But in his Summa, St. Thomas argues that it is impossible now for people to attain even the natural part of that end, prescribed by the eternal law and made possible by the natural law, by mere means of the natural law, as a result of the wounding of nature after the fall. St. Thomas teaches, all the powers of the soul have been rendered destitute of their proper order, which destitution is called a wounding of nature. In one of his last works on the 2 precepts of charity, he goes even farther and claims, I quote, that the natural law has been destroyed in us, destructa erat, by the fall. This wounding manifests itself in different ways. Remember, we said the natural law gives man the ability to know the truth through the inclinations of nature leading him toward his end. However, after the fall, these inclinations are disordered. They're confused with the lower passions, inclinations which are not natural to man, but which appear natural to us due to these wounding. And so we can become confused by what we mistake for the natural inclinations. And our confusion can lead to misunderstanding of the precepts, the principles of the natural law. Now, all is not lost, however, because immediately after making this startling to me statement that the natural law has been destroyed in us, St. Thomas goes on to say that it was necessary for man to be redirected to the works of virtue and turned away from vice. So God did not abandon us. Therefore, the law of the Scriptures was necessary. The law of the Scriptures, the lex scripturae, is part of another category of law, which St. Thomas calls the divine law, which needed to be promulgated after the fall. Because this first grace, along with all grace, has been wounded and forfeited by man. He emphasizes that the natural law is now obligatory on man to even know his natural end, to say nothing of his supernatural end. To know what is good and the principles of distinguishing good from evil, the natural law obliges us to perform. We are obliged to have access and recourse to the divine law. He uses the Latin word oportebat to emphasize how necessary the divine law is. It was necessary for this new law to be promulgated for men to attain virtuous living. The divine law is not optional or gratuitous, but is necessary now for the rational participation in the eternal law, or, in other words, the natural law to be followed. St. Thomas drives this point home further when he argues, it is obvious that all people are not able to persevere in knowledge, and therefore a brief summary of the law was given by Christ, so that it might be able to be known by all, and nobody would be able to be excused of the observation of it through ignorance. Look around us. Our civil governments have abandoned recourse to the divine law. And so what laws do they propose? The protection of something which is not marriage. The natural law puts before man the good of marriage, the procreation and proper rearing and education of children, but is the natural law which defines what marriage is, reinforced by the divine precepts teaching what marriage is. When we throw out the church, the guardian of the tenets of the divine law, and thereby the guardian of the natural law, we don't know what marriage means. And again, look across Europe and my own country at the false laws that are being proposed and adopted, purporting to bring forward a good. But they don't know what they're doing because they have severed the source of accurate knowledge of the natural law. St. Thomas maintains that the precepts of divine law encompass all that the natural law obligates us to do, the whole law in his terms. He who observes the divine command and law fulfills the whole law. This whole phrase, totum legem, to me appears to be a reference to the eternal law itself, since the eternal law is the entire rule and measure of the universe. It contains all of law, including natural law, which is nothing but a participation. Yet the divine law participates in the eternal law more perfectly than our human reason can, because the divine law is a direct product of God's mind itself. The divine law is not mediated through human weakened reason. Pope Leo XIII explains, to exclude the church founded by God himself from life, from laws, from the education of youth, from domestic society is a grave and fatal error. A state from which religion is banished can never be well regulated, and already perhaps more than is desirable is known of the nature and tendency of the so-called civil philosophy of life and morals. The Church of Christ is the true and sole teacher of virtue and guardian of morals. She it is who preserves in their purity the principles from which duties flow, and by setting forth most urgent reasons for virtuous life, bids us not only to turn away from wicked deeds, but even to curb all movements of the mind that are opposed to reason, a la the natural law, even though they be not carried out in action. And so the answer for the other errors that surround us, is an abandonment of our guide, our route, to getting back to where we were supposed to be from the beginning, being able to follow the natural law. Now, we see the source of this problem. We don't know what these words mean anymore without the explanation given to us by God. But let's look at this a little further by delving into the area I spend much of my day job with, talking about human law, man-made law. What is it? Human-made law are merely determinations made from the natural law. So the natural law contains principles of general application. Good is to be done. Marriage and the procreation and education of children is to be fostered. Truth is to be known. But these are general principles. we must translate them into specific decisions on action. And that is what human law is meant to do, to effect these particular determinations. So let me give you an example. As part of the natural law and the respect and preservation of life, we are obligated as a general principle to conduct our lives in a way that is not unnecessarily dangerous to the other people around us. That's a general principle. So what does that mean? Well, we should not drive down the highways in a way that will endanger unnecessarily other people. We can understand that. But how do we do that? If we all just got on the road and drove whichever direction on whichever side we chose, it would be a disaster and would violate this principle of the natural law. But some people might like to drive on the left, some on the right. Someone has to determine how to live out this principle in practice. There's nothing inherently, I'm sorry to the English among us, morally good and justified about driving on the left side of the road. It's equally good to the right as long as we determine that's what we should do. And that's the purpose of human law, to fulfill the particularization, the determination of these general principles. Again, the example St. Thomas uses, the natural law says that evil should be punished. But in which way? How long? What punishment? This needs to be determined. And this is the job of human law, to make particular determinations of these general principles. These laws, these particular determinations, are framed by man. Again, this is the greatness of God. He governs the universe, but asks man to participate that governance. It's what St. Paul means when he says all authority comes from God. God could govern us directly, as he does the animals, through instinct. They have no choice, they follow it. But instead, he shares his authority with man to take his law and particularize it. So these laws made by man, though, are either just or unjust. Now we have the definition of justice, again, provided by the natural law. If they be just, they have the power of binding, not because men made them, not because the king has spoken, but they bind in conscience from the eternal law, whence they are derived. The authority of human governments and human law rests upon its participation in the eternal law. Or put another way, the participation in the kingship of Christ, of which society the eternal law is the Constitution. Only by governing civil society, making particular human laws that are in harmony with these higher laws, is the law just. Now we have a definition of justice. A law which is a true particularization of the natural law. Man, again, cannot even attain his natural end of virtuous happiness in life without this conformity to the natural law, to say nothing of his supernatural end, which is even more difficult to attain. Again, returning to Pope Leo XIII, and all of my quotations are again from Immortale Dei. He explains that in a society constituted on these Christian truths that we've just described, divine and human things, the two ends of man, are equitably shared, the rights of citizens assured to them, and fenced round by divine, by natural, and by human law. The harmony, again, notice among the three. The duties incumbent on each one being wisely marked out and their fulfillment fittingly ensured. Here lies the true safeguard against human tyranny, not in a fictitious social contract made and therefore destroyable by men, not made by mere human decisions, but the true refuge of the true liberty of men is the kingship of Christ and conformity of all human laws to the eternal law through the natural and the divine law. Now, how do we apply these? How do we make particular determinations of the natural and divine law? Well, just as man has two ends, he has two organizations or societies which direct man to those two ends. These are two perfect communities, and perfect in the sense of complete. Their living out of their life on the human level has imperfections, but they are perfect in the sense that they encompass a complete end of man, the natural or the supernatural. And these two societies are related to the natural end of man, civil society, and related to the supernatural end of man, the church. Their mission is to assist man in these particular determinations of natural and divine law. Again, returning to St. Thomas's explanation of these points, he explains, as we've said, that all men must make particular determinations of action. What should I do right now in this circumstance? And there are three ways that these determinations can be made. First, the individual himself determining what the natural law requires. Secondly, by his personal superior. And the example he gives of a parent for the child. You should do this. You should clean your room. Third, it should be determined by those in authority who are entrusted with the determination which relates to an action affecting the common good of man, the common good of society. And St. Thomas explains that these determinations are to be made by those temporal or spiritual authorities who are entrusted with the determination of these matters affecting the common good. Again, the church and the governors of civil society. And each of these spheres are entrusted with this great gift of God. Prior to the redemption purchased by Christ, God had to take a more active role. If we look at his nation, his chosen people, God had to legislate and make determinations directly for them. In addition to the natural law, which he legislated in the divine law of the Decalogue, he also adopted specific precepts for the governing of his chosen people. However, as St. Thomas explains, after the new law, the law of grace, when grace is restored, he then entrusts to proper authorities of church and civil society these particular determinations. The specifications of human action that affect the common good no longer need to be made in such detail by God himself because grace has restored some of what was lost. And so this is the responsibility, as we've said, of the two perfect societies, the church and the civil society. Now, these determinations affect, as we have said, both spheres of man's end, both his natural and his supernatural end. Leo XIII again explains that man has these two, but they are not severable. And again, the analogy, I think, works to understanding the hypostatic union in our Lord. We know our Lord has two natures, but they are combined in one person. Man also is one person, possessing two ends. And just as our Lord's natures, once united in the hypostatic union, cannot just be divided off into two persons, so too man cannot be cut down the middle. Say, well, here's your natural end and your supernatural end is over there. They exist in one unified substance, in one person. Now, some of the decisions man has to make clearly relate more to his temporal end, his natural end. Specifically, driving on the road, our example. Others relate more directly to his supernatural end. Others are what Leo XIII calls of mixed jurisdiction. They affect both ends. And so Leo XIII explains, in matters, however, of mixed jurisdiction, an issue, because man is a single person that affects both his natural and his supernatural end, it is in the highest degree consonant to nature, to natural law, in other words, as also to the designs of God, the divine law, that so far as from one of the powers separating itself from the other, or still less coming into conflict with it, complete harmony, such as is suited to the end for which such power exists, should be preserved between them. So, these, as St. Thomas referred, both temporal and spiritual authorities are entrusted with determinations. The division of labor between them is the temporal authorities primarily concern themselves with determinations affecting the natural end of man. Spiritual authorities making particular determinations that affect the supernatural end of man. And so it is not for the civil government to make laws determining the days of fast that should be observed. The obligation to fast comes from the divine and natural law. But again, on what days should I do it? That belongs to the authorities of the church. Likewise, specific laws about traffic patterns and other matters affecting the natural sphere belong to the civil society. But many, many issues cross both. And let's look at an example to understand this. Laws regarding work and the regulation of work. We know from the natural law that man has to perform work to preserve life. We know from the divine law, by the sweat of your brow you shall earn your bread, that he is obligated. Right? We know that from the divine law, man is also obligated to honor the Lord's day. Again, the church's obligation is to specify how the Lord's day is to be honored, but it's an obligation of divine and natural law. And so the civil society says, well, our obligation is to regulate for the good of the common good how work is done in our society. And so they want to pass a law saying, well, we will have more temporal goods which are necessary for man's virtuous life if people work 7 days a week. But now we have a realm of mixed jurisdiction because the church intervenes to say, okay, that may be efficient, but that interferes with man's ability to fulfill his supernatural end and to obey the divine command to render the just honor due to God 1 day a week. And so the natural end of more efficiently providing the necessary goods for life must be subordinated to the supernatural end. When St. Thomas lays out the ends of man and the principles of natural law, he makes clear that they are a hierarchy. They are independent and complete, but the supernatural, by virtue of its title as supernatural, must take precedence over the natural if they come into conflict. To, again, help understand this issue, Leo XIII invokes a very old Catholic metaphor created by John of Salisbury, the body politic. John of Salisbury, in his famous political work, describes civil society as a human being, as a human body. And specifically, he names the different parts of a human body, of a human person, that relate in this metaphor. And so the head of the body is the prince, the ruler, the civil ruler of society. My favorite analogy is the financiers are the intestines of the body. The bankers are the intestines. But, more importantly, the soul of the body is the church. The soul must be united to the body. Leo XIII, I believe, invokes this Catholic image when he says thus regarding the relation of the church to the state. The Almighty, therefore, has given the charge of the human race to two powers, the ecclesiastical and the civil, the one being set over divine and the other over human things, which is what we've just said. Each, in its kind, is supreme. Each has fixed limits within which it is contained. But inasmuch as each of these two powers has authority over the same subjects, and as it might come to pass that one and the same thing relate differently, but still remaining one and the same thing, might belong to the jurisdiction and determination of both, therefore God has foreseen all things, and who is the author of these two powers, all authority comes from God, has marked out the course of each in right correlation to the other. There must accordingly exist between these two powers a certain orderly connection which may be compared to the union of the soul and the body in man. Now, we all know the definition, even though many of our politicians don't. We know the definition of death. It is the separation of the soul from the body. And so what will happen to civil society if the soul, the church, is separated from the body, the temporal sphere? Death. In thinking of the message of Fatima, I think this thought gives a new meaning, or an additional meaning, to the prediction of the annihilation of nations. I mean, clearly it refers to the death, the physical death of people. But on this level, when looking at this era of Russia, I believe it predicts the annihilation of nations in the sense that they will become dead corpses because the soul, the church, will be separated from the body. This is exactly why, this is grave consequences, death. This is why Blessed Pope Pius IX, seeing this error of the Enlightenment that was to be spread by Russia, vigorously condemned the proposition the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church in his syllabus, because he saw separation is death. In contrast to the dead corpse of civil society, and we see its consequences all around us, with the soul removed, the dead corpse is out of control. Government is unchecked. Just go to the airport and see how government of power is unchecked. Not only in Europe, in my own country, where under recent laws, the military can throw you in prison without trial, without even accusing you of anything, because the soul is separated. In contrast to this death, St. Thomas describes a truly Christian, therefore truly human, order of the world. He says, therefore, since the beatitude of heaven is the end of that virtuous life which we live at present, it pertains to the king's office, the temporal ruler, to promote the good life of the multitude in such a way as to make it suitable for the attainment of heavenly happiness. That is to say, he should command those things which lead to the happiness of heaven, and as far as possible, forbid the contrary. What conduces to true beatitude and what hinders it are learned from the law of God, the teaching of which belongs to the office of the priest. The ruler of civil society knows not the principles to determine without the guidance of the church. There are three variations, as we saw in the beginning with the two constitutions, of this error. Right? And for this, I'm drawing on Henry Grenier's 4-volume Thomistic philosophy, and his volume specifically on moral philosophy. He describes this traditional teaching, which we've discussed, that the state, the civil society, must not put any obstacles in the way of the church attaining its end, and in case of any collision must yield to she who is the guardian of the contents of the natural and divine law. And he says there are three varieties of the denial of this truth. The first he labels the rigorist or pure, and that's what we see in the Russian Constitution, which is the state is the source of all rights. Hence, the church is not even a juridical society. It doesn't even exist in this more blatant form. Their motto, as Grenier, is the church from the state and in and under the state. There's secondly a moderate liberal version of the separation of church and state. In this version, the church is recognized as a juridical society, but merely a human association, which is subordinate to the state. So the supernatural is subordinate to the natural, a demonic inversion of ends. Their motto is a free church in a free state. The third version, Grenier labels liberal Catholicism. This liberal Catholicism admits in theory, yes, the church is superior to the state, the supernatural above the natural. But in practice, insists upon the separation of the church and state as the system by which the church can best adapt itself to the times of the modern systems of government. So admit it in theory, deny it in practice. Grenier says their motto, therefore, is the same as the middle, the moderate liberals, a free church in a free state. And we see through the different constitutions of civil states and through the liberal Catholicism taught for the past 40 years, an adoption of one of these three forms of the error. Without the soul informing the body in any of these separations, the constitutions which contain provisions of security, peace, and justice are literally empty words. Remember that Russian constitution. Right? I want to look at a few more provisions and of the European Constitution to show you that when the church is separated and subordinated to the state, the words are meaningless because the content has been stripped. In 1977, the Soviet Union, in order to form a more perfect union, adopted a new constitution. I'll just quote from a few provisions. Look at the focus exclusively on the natural end and the concepts of natural law invoked, but which, as we know from the practice in the Soviet Union, had no meaning. Article 42. Citizens of the USSR have the right to health protection. Citizens of the USSR have the right to maintenance in old age, in sickness, and in the event of complete or partial disability or loss of the breadwinner. Focus on purely the natural. Citizens of the USSR have the right to housing. Citizens of the USSR have the right to education. But what kind of education? The right is ensured by free provision of education by the institutions of universal, compulsory, secondary education. Remember, the church shall be separated from the schools. And formal development of vocational, specialized secondary education. What's the goal of education? Only the natural end, vocational, not in the religious sense, but in the efficiency sense. Article 50. In accordance with the interest of the people and in order to strengthen and develop the socialist system, citizens of the USSR are guaranteed freedom of speech, of the press, and of assembly, meetings, street processions, and demonstrations. Ask any of the dissidents sent to the Gulag what those words meant. They had no meaning. They sound great, but when severed from the natural and divine law, they mean whatever the ruling authority wants them to mean. For the good of socialism, you have a right to free speech, but that means you can't speak about this. They can manipulate the meanings by emptying them of content. The soul has left the body. Citizens of the USSR, Article 52, are guaranteed freedom of conscience. And we've read this before. It's a repeat of 1918. That is the right to profess and not to profess any religion, to conduct religious worship or authentic propaganda or anti-religious propaganda. In the USSR, to incite hostility or hatred of religion. In the USSR, the church is separated from the state and the school from the church. That's the hard form or the rigorous form. Let's look at the European Union of Fundamental Human Rights, the softer form, the one that sounds more attractive. Incorporated, as we said, democratically by denying the vote of the citizens of Europe when they said no, by imposing a treaty on them. It's like Napoleon. You will vote for this. Thank you for voting for it. Oh, you didn't vote for it? Well, it's happening anyway. The peoples of Europe, in creating an ever closer union among them, are resolved to share a peaceful future based on common values. What's the source of these values? Conscious of its spiritual and moral heritage. Well, I'm sorry, that spiritual and moral heritage involved the union of soul and body. The union is founded on the indivisible universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity. These words are defined by the natural law, taught by the church. It is based, and that's not in the Constitution, that was my addition or correction. It is based on the principles of democracy and the rule of law. But they mean by that the rule of human law, not the rule of God's law. It places the individual at the heart of its activities not God at the heart of its activities, by establishing the citizenship of the Union and by creating an area of freedom, security, and justice. Article 9, right to marry and right to found a family. The right to marry and the right to found a family shall be guaranteed in accordance with national laws governing the exercise of these rights. But what is marriage? When they reject the natural and divine law, they now use this provision to say 2 men have a right to marry. It's guaranteed in the Constitution, because we define that as marriage. Because they've severed the teacher who can explain to them, you don't define marriage. The eternal law defined what marriage is. Article 10, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But then you can adopt laws putting people in prison for expressing thoughts that are against the zeitgeist. This right includes freedom to change religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or in private to manifest religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Notice the Russian Constitution. In order to promote freedom, we separate the church and state. Article 22, cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. The Union shall respect cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. But it means nothing. The right to education. Everyone has the right to education and to have access to vocational, remember the Soviet Constitution, and continuing training, the natural end. Ask the families in Germany who are put in jail for homeschooling their children so that they can preserve the Catholic faith about their Article 14 right to education. It means nothing, because by education, they don't mean education according to the natural law. They mean mere training. Article 11, freedom of expression and information. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. Look at hate crimes legislation. For speaking the truth, the natural law, in many jurisdictions, it's a crime. These words are meaningless. Social security, the right to health care. I won't read them, but notice the focus, just like the Soviet Constitution, purely on the natural end. And America is not far behind, a la Obamacare. So we see the fruits of this separation of church and state. Any guarantees of human law in the name of liberty are meaningless. The true liberty of all men, to quote from Gratian, who opens his treatise on canon law by explaining the relationship of divine and natural law to human law, that true liberty of all men only comes through the natural and divine law as taught by the church. Only by returning to these principles will the ills of our out-of-control government be solved. John Dickinson, in his introduction to the classic Catholic treatment, where he coins this body politic, John Dickinson describes the former Catholic worldview before the errors of Russia thus. It has become an historical commonplace that medieval thought was dominated by the conception of a body of law existing independently of the authority of any government, and to which all positive law, where he means human law, must conform, and to which government, no less than individuals, owed obedience. Rulers were thought of as bound by a higher law, which accordingly made it possible to apply to their acts another criterion of legality or illegality. In the words of the Polycratus, his work, between a tyrant and the true prince there is this single or chief difference. The latter obeys the law and rules the people by his dictates. A tyrant is one who oppresses the people by rulership based upon force, while he who rules in accordance with the laws is a prince. There are certain precepts of the law which have a perpetual necessity, having the force of law among all nations. And not only do I withdraw from the hands of rulers the power of dispensing with the law, but in my opinion, those laws which carry a perpetual injunction, the natural and divine law, are subject at all to their pleasure. And so why is the consecration of Russia proposed as the remedy for this error of Russia. Let's see how appropriate it is. Because this separation of church and state was a crusade, an unholy crusade launched by the rulers of civil society who wanted more power. By freeing the soul, they thought they'd have more power. But sadly, the authorities of the church have become complicit. Since the Second Vatican Council, the rulers of the church sit behind the wall of separation and cry over that wall to the rulers of civil society. You don't need me in a Faustian bargain to be left alone. Please don't persecute me. I'll be good. I'll stay behind my wall of separation. You can go and build a just society without me on the dead corpse of the desouled civil society. Just leave me alone, please. That bargain was struck, and the church's teaching in this matter was silenced. But like all Faustian bargains, this one is going to be broken and is being broken by civil society. That wall of separation behind which the church has imprisoned herself, self-imprisoned herself, is shrinking. Look at my own country. The recent mandates that the civil society passed telling the church to fund contraception. Consecrating Russia would be an act in accordance with this philosophy, saying the nation needs to be set aside and consecrated, the soul put back in the body. Look at the example of our Lord's resurrection. We do not speak of his body returning to his soul. We say his soul returned to his body. The church needs to rise up out of her self-imposed prison and re-enter the body politic. Otherwise, we will have around us the annihilation of nations. This is the only way to put content back into the high-sounding words of the human constitutions, is to put the soul back in the body. This is why Our Lady called for the consecration by the church of a nation, of a civil society. This act is an act that will affirm the union of sacred and temporal, of soul and body. The act is a denial, by its very nature, of the separation of church and state. May God make it so. Thank you for your attention.